When I think of alignment, I think of at least two dimensions. I think of understanding, which I think you alluded to, and commitment.
Yep.
Would you agree with those, or would you add anything or subtract anything?
I think the understanding, I think those are both great ones. I mean, those are two dimensions. One is the understanding and the visibility to what the risks are of what path we're going down, and we fully considered our different options, and we've consciously decided that this is the path we're going down. So that understanding is really important. And then the commitment that, yes, this is a path we're going down. Not everyone's 100% comfortable with it, or there's some that may even disagree with it, but this is the path we're going down. So I totally agree. It's the understanding is probably the most important part of that, because I think a lot of companies think they understand, but they don't really understand. They think they have the best answer, and it may very well be the best answer, but they haven't accounted for the risks or thought about, well, what's the dark side of what it is we're about to do, and how do we account for that? And so if you have a plan where you feel like it's a pretty risk-free plan, and you've mitigated all your risks, then something's wrong. You haven't really. There's always a risk. There's always a trade-off that you've made. You just may not have identified what they are yet. So I think that commitment is the understanding of the risks and the clear definition of what the project is and what it's going to entail is the first piece. And the commitment to it is I agree, an important second point.
You did a clip just recently about change management's dead. I think was your catch cry. So is that just to provoke that we should change and not enough people are changing, or is it, what was the basis of that clip as such?
Sometimes I'll do videos to test reactions and see, kind of to test the status quo. And that one got a stronger response than even I thought, both positive and negative. But the idea there, I mean, the thing that triggered it is I feel like there's a complacency with change management, even with change management practitioners. I see, especially with ProSci and all these certifications now, I feel like people hide behind I've got ProSci certification, so I'm creating awareness within my organization. Okay, so people are aware. Big deal. I mean, the change still isn't happening. They may be more aware, but the change isn't becoming operational. So the thing that was inspired, it was just, I think there's just a different way that change has to be thought of. It shouldn't be some magical, mystical, certification-based thing that only experts can do. It should be something that an organization owns. They can lean on experts to infuse the knowledge and the tool sets, but ultimately the companies need to own it. So in some ways, I was trying to call out the change management consulting industry, which is never a good idea when that's where I came from, and most of my peers are change management consultants, so that's why I created this.
Going back a little bit, you don't have to flip back, but you said that you adopting best practices or off-the-shelf processes led to more problems instead of fewer problems. I was surprised to see that. I've had the opposite experience.
With best practices leading to more problems?
With not adopting the best practices or using the software the way the software was designed, but trying to modify the software to follow your existing business practices, software modifications and everything else. I've had lots of problems dealing with those, but your slide was kind of the opposite of that.
Which slide? Just like
Number 14.
14.
Number 4.
Number 4. Those that relied more on best practices and off-the-shelf software functionality to drive their transformations actually experienced the most difficulties. Yeah, and that's a great point, and that's a really important point that we talk about when we get into process management and how to segregate your business processes into two buckets. Generally, we have to assume that any company is going to have some level of customization. It's just a matter of how much are we willing to tolerate and how much should we tolerate, and what are the reasons why we might customize, and being very clear about that. But to back up for a second, back to your question, the companies that rely on just, we're going to do this vanilla off the shelf, the way the software is built, run into two problems. One is they find that no software out there is going to be able to fully support their business with just the best practices that are baked into the software. And worse yet, those expectations around what a vanilla off-the-shelf software means and having that unrealistic assumption as a factor in determining how much time and cost it's going to be usually leads companies to underestimate time and cost. So then when you get halfway through the project or whatever point along the way, you realize that we didn't budget enough time, money, or resources to the project, and now we've got to cut back on things like change management and other things that are going to be super critical to the success. So it's not that best practices themselves are a problem, it's that they don't always apply, but yet third parties in the industry will sell them as though they are that silver bullet that's going to solve all your problems. We set our expectations accordingly, and those unrealistic expectations lead to a bunch of bad decisions later on. So it's a kind of an indirect impact, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Sure.
Can I ask you a question? So you said 750 million into this project in the year. What's the scale of the project, or what should this project have cost? I would think at some point that number has got to be lighting up everybody's desk. How big of a project was it?
As far as what it should have cost? Actually, I don't know what it should have cost.
I don't know what it should have cost either, but here's kind of
Or what they expected to cost, I don't know.
the fundamental issue that was going on is that the SAP software they were trying to implement, its inventory management module was keyed towards the retail price of the product that Little sold, and Little had traditionally, for decades, keyed all of its analytics to the actual purchase price of the good that it had sold. So there was a fundamental incompatibility between the software and the way that their business processes were set up. And I think part of the cost overrun was because Little had a massive resistance to change. So instead of adapting their processes to the system, what they ended up doing was doing a massive amount of customization. I don't know the exact number because that's not really in the information, but I'm sure that had to contribute to the high cost. And it's kind of like what you said earlier. I mean, it's a seesaw effect, right? I don't think that necessarily customization is bad. I think the vast majority of the implementations that I've been involved in, there's at least some level of customization, and I think it makes sense. We were talking about it earlier today. But I think the more customization that you have, it's an indication that I think that there's a problem, that maybe the change management aspect of that needs to kind of even it out a little bit. So I think that's how they ended up where they were at. Where they were supposed to be, I'm not really sure.
You mentioned in the past concepts of transformation fatigue, things like that. Can you elaborate on what that looked like in Newport and how you guys are continuing to fight that?
Yeah, so I think for us, and the whole notion of change management, we don't like the term, but we do need to engage in the practices. So I think what was most challenging for us is, you think, well, we're going to be live and then we go. Well, we all know that there's more work to be done after that. And as you're putting an ERP in place for a group, there were a lot of things that took time for people to get used to. You now got data librarians. You don't get to make your own changes. It's more central, and we never use the term central. You get punched if you use the term central in Newport. You just can't say it. But that's kind of what's happening. And the level of frustration that would grow in each mill that would go live because they felt like, well, we're losing our ownership, was fatiguing. How do we respond to that? Because we don't want people to lose ownership. So where we had to bring that back to is pulling people together and getting them with our customers. What are our customers asking for? Where are their pain points? How do we align our practices? How do we take the tools up here and connect them with our customers and create better connectivity so that people can see how this picture is working. So just really, I just tell you that the grind of the change and the initial perceptions of we're losing control, really, it was really challenging. People were really frustrated, you don't get rid of all the frustration, but if our folks didn't see the value, it was just de-energizing.
Typically, who do you sue? Do you sue the system implementer or the vendor, the software product vendor?
Well, I think a standard lawyer answer is we sue everybody, right? But you're going to take a step back, right? And you're going to look at the facts and you're going to make sure that the facts support the allegations that you make. So there's plenty of lawsuits that we get involved in where the actual software vendor didn't implement the software, and the software itself wasn't problematic necessarily, it was the process. I think Eric said it earlier today, and it's going to be said a few more times over the duration of this conference, generally the technology works, right? The software works. What we see when we're involved in an ERP implementation failure, it's not a failure of the technology or the software necessarily. It's a failure of the process. It's a people problem, because these are not, what did you say, these are not IT projects? Right? Yeah, they're people projects, and they have to be managed that way. And that's when we get involved. Now, that's not to say that we've got oversold technology and technology that truly didn't work. We see that too, but it's not that common.
Yeah, but it's a common allegation, isn't it, to say the software didn't work?
Yeah, it is a common allegation, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in Dan and I's session about what that means and how you tie that, and there's warranties and representations and why those sometimes don't mean very much and don't provide a lot of resolution for you.
I have a question for you, Walter. You mentioned be critical of sales, and I have a question that's directed directly at you. I've gone through the process, and I'm in the selection phase now, and I shortlisted a number of ERP projects, and your 2020 top 10 list happened to come out at the same time, and there was a great deal of alignment between where I was headed and what you shared. And my question, and this is a very personal one here, is how reliable is the information that you shared at that point in time based on your assessment of those top 10 ERP packages? So based on the fact that weeks have gone by, is your opinion still sound where you had voiced your opinion at that point in time, or have there been changes that have occurred in the weeks?
I'd say the question is how much that analysis and comparison applies to you and your company, because it's an average, it's across the board. These are based on the criteria mentioned in the video and the article.
I read the video back a dozen times, so I've...
Yeah. So but the key though is that the criteria you use is going to be different than the average. So that's, intentionally, the top 10 list is meant to stimulate conversation and, have an interesting discussion around how those different systems compare to one another. Obviously, none of them, I think I'm fairly balanced in the video of calling out the strengths and the weaknesses of all the different products there. But, having said that, there's plenty of times where the ones that are in the top 3 or 5 on the list are nowhere on a short list that we give to a client because it just doesn't make sense for their industry, or there's something unique about them, or that it's not that list doesn't apply, but it's a top 10 list across industries, company sizes, and geographies. So it's just only so relevant it can be to any one company. So I don't think my opinion hasn't changed, but any client I talk to, if I were to do a top 10 list for any given client or prospective client, it's going to look totally different each time just based on what it is they're looking for and what their priorities are. Does that make sense?
So one of the objectives you mentioned earlier is to provide that consistent customer experience for all the entities. But with the product group, how did you achieve that and unify that process?
That's a really good question, and I would say we've not achieved it yet. We're working on it, and that's been hard. So one of the things I've learned most is if you can make a great digital product, and everybody in this room probably already knows this. You can make a great digital product and say, "Here you go. This is awesome. Use this." And people are like, "No thanks." And we've done that. So one of the things that we've done that to me is one of the funnest things that I like to see and be a part of is we have kind of built, and we had some help building this, a process where we will visit customers. And it's a very structured process where we will speak to people starting at the point of touch. They actually touch us. And there is a series of questions in this engagement where we're understanding choice factors that are important. Why do you choose Nucor? What is it in these transactions that would make things easier for you to choose Nucor? What about our services? Are there things in terms of the product? Are there things in terms of the engagement? We ask all these questions, and we're capturing it. And we ask about choices that they would make about our competitors. And in that process where we're visiting the customers, we don't send our salespeople. It might be a salesperson, but they're not responsible for the account. This is not about selling. We don't want the customer to feel like, oh, they're here to sell. We are there to listen, and we're there to gather data on choice factors. We take that data and we actually plot it in a Venn diagram where we can understand the choice factors where we have advantage, where we have disadvantage to our competitors, and where we're at parity. And we can look at that, and that quantifies the choice factors and the perception of that customer, how they touch us. So we start at the point of touch and we'll expand it throughout the chain, because the person who's actually purchasing, their choice factors are different than the VP of purchasing. We want to understand that chain. So we call it small ball. This is, kind of micro marketing. The first one you do, all you do is get insight on that one customer. That doesn't solve the whole thing. You start to do more. You build the trends and you build the case on where your typical pain points are, either with your people or your tools, and then you can use that data to help your team understand how the customer feels.
So it sounds to me your guys' definition between business requirements and process and workflows are different. Somehow when we talk about our requirements, we talk about process and workflows. Can you help me elaborate that a little bit more? The difference between the two and how they connect.
So think of a process as more of the steps and how information and orders and data in your organization flows, and how decisions are made, and just the overall flow. And it doesn't matter if it's a ERP system or if it's a pen and paper or Excel spreadsheets or whatever. As an organization, you do these things, and these are the steps you go through as an organization. So that's the business process map. But within each step, you're going to have requirements of when I create a purchase order or a sales order, or when I close the books, or when I reconcile my GL, whatever the case may be. These are the steps within that, or these are the things I need to make sure that step in the process covers. So I almost view it as kind of a sub-bullets within a step in a process would be the more the requirements piece of it. I mean, ultimately, the whole thing is, it's all your requirements. It's your process and but the requirements themselves are less sequential and more definition of what that step in the process means and what the details are of that step.
How are you moving from actively working with questioning these people to having quantitative data that you can represent this way? Are you providing them with this continuum and saying, pick where you think we are and where we should be, or is it the result of a whole series of questions where you're coming up with some formula that does that?
It's a great question. It's more the former. So it's actually what we'll do logistically. What we found commonly works really well is you have an executive team of 5 or 10 people, however many it is. We'll facilitate sessions in a room, and we'll actually do a green dot and red dot workshop session where we'll have them, we give them physically little stickers that they'll come up, we'll have it up on the wall, we'll have these continuums, and we'll ask them to put where you think you are today. We'll have a discussion around that. Then we'll have them come up and individually put where they think they want to be in the future, and we'll have a discussion around that. And that draws out a lot of qualitative, subjective discussion that helps us kind of fine tune it a bit. So it's trying to add a little bit of science to something that's very subjective and qualitative, and there's no measurable way to measure it. But what we do say is, on a scale of 1 to 5, where do you, 1 being completely standard process, all the way up to flexible processes, or sometimes sometimes clients prefer if we say this is 0, this is -5, +5, and be on a spectrum, whatever we try to add some structure to it to where they have a little bit of guidance and parameter around how they take something subjective and apply it to this. But that workshop usually stimulates a lot of conversation because it's very visual. So,
question around the kind of the specificity or the detail of those requirements, because sometimes we'll see requirements come through and says system integrator shall deliver an ERP system or an MES system, whatever it is. Like, okay, it's pretty broad, and stemming, there's a lot of different things that go into that. So I think sometimes folks will see, like, okay, we covered it broadly, so anything, we got a real wide lane. Like, from a legal perspective, what's your recommendation from the client side of that, and from a consultant or integrator standpoint, like, what's the sweet spot of that?
Yeah, I think sophisticated consultants that we deal with on the other side, they understand when we want to be detail-oriented and the reasons for it, because that to me is virtually useless, right? I mean, how do you enforce that? How do you even know what you're actually getting or implementing? I mean, I'll use the example of, we're licensing software. Okay, well, on the schedule, we're ordering 50 users of SAP S/4HANA. Okay, well, what does that mean? Or you're licensing, 50 warehouse users. There's no definition. So everything's got to be specific, because you've got to contract like you're going to have a dispute, because the likelihood that you will have a dispute is relatively high, and you want You want that contract essentially to function as a management tool, you know? And like I said before, I mean, you want to be able to pull that thing out of your desk, have it well documented and say, no, this is exactly what we're supposed to do in this situation. And that way, you know, you don't have to worry about it. But if you don't have specifics, and you don't have specifics in the contract, you're inviting issues, right? You're setting yourself up for failure rather than success.
Sort of a foundational question is, how do you get your executive team to even agree to go through this exercise?
That is it's a great question. It's funny because by the look on your face as you were asking that, I had a feeling it was going to be something like that. Like, how do you even, let's back up a minute. Let's back up and just start with, how do you even get the right people in the room? Well, that's a great point. You know, one thing we'll do a lot of times for a lot of clients is do kind of an executive boot camp, and we'll frame it. I don't want to say it's a Trojan horse approach, but it's a way to educate the executive team on, you know, what do these projects typically look like? What do we expect of you as an executive team? And it's really just trying to cut through some of the misunderstandings or the myths of transformations, and in particular the executive myths. Executives are guilty of a certain type of bias that is very common, which is, you know, the easy button, the silver bullet, and that's how system integrators and vendors are so good at selling to them, because they tell them all the things they want to hear, which is, oh yeah, you don't need to customize, we have industry best practices, you know, stuff like that, where it's giving them the answers they want to hear. So our job becomes to be not the bearer of bad news, but we're there to educate on, here's what did you know that this is how the actual average implementation looks, and these are the common challenges that we see, and this is how you can really mitigate some of those challenges. So it becomes more of a foundational educational exercise and expectation setting exercise that then typically leads to, here's what we need from you. We need to make a series of decisions that only you can make as an executive team. Ron and his team can't make it, or you can, but you don't want them to. You need to be making it, because this is you're setting the tone and direction for the company. Once you've made those decisions, then and only then can you start to delegate, you know, the rest of the project off to Ron and whoever else on the team. So that's generally the way we do it, and that's generally a role we help clients play, which is, you know, it's not you saying, we're saying no, Ron or his people can't make that decision, and they shouldn't be making that decision, it needs to be you, and here's what we need from you. Usually that works. I mean, I can't remember a time recently where executives still refused to have this meeting, but we have had lots of clients that weren't ready just to jump in and schedule all these executive meetings without having that foundational piece first. And generally what we do with a lot of clients is we'll just start here. We'll do that foundational thing, and then we'll start to get into some of it here, because most executives understand that we need to understand the overall goals and objectives of the company, and most of them have it in their heads. They're happy to discuss it. Then we start to get into translating that into what it means for this project. Then as a next step, okay, we've started, but now we need to get into this next level of detail, and then we start to schedule, you know, get their buy-in to schedule the next series here. So we kind of ease our way into it. It's not, you usually don't just spring it on them overnight. Other questions?
I do have one. What do I do in the case where I get executive alignment and I completely disagree with what they've decided, and I know I'm right? Because I know I'm oriented, at least on some decisions.
You know what? That's a really good question. I think I would have to think about that more and answer that at a break or something, because that's.
I'll leave that one with you.
What I will say is just a general summary answer is that a lot of times it comes down to the educational piece of it, because I mean, there are decisions that, you know, I might have been a little bit flippant when I was commenting over here that, you know, our job is not to say you're right or wrong or whatever, but there are times where, you know, we have to guide people to the conclusion that sounds like a terrible idea, and here's why, you know, without saying those words. But at the end of the day, you know, you're in the same boat too. Ultimately, they're going to decide what they decide, but all we can do is educate them on, you do realize there's a huge risk here, and here's what it is. And usually if you frame it in that way, and, you know, frame it in the context of, okay, so what are we going to do about this risk? Generally, that leads them back to the answer of, well, let's make a decision that doesn't have that risk, you know, because usually mitigating that risk is so big that it's easier just to go down a different path. So usually that works, but there are times where they're going to do what they do. But the key here is, though, they own it. The big problem is if you somehow had ownership of that decision and it becomes your problem, you're the the bullseye's on you on why did you make that decision. And that's, as people in the room, you know, as individuals with careers to manage in the room, I'm not talking about you as an organization, but you as individuals, most of you are going to have to mitigate, that's a big risk you have to mitigate personally, is I can't have this on my back to make, because I'm not going to make the right decision because I'm shooting in the dark. I need the executives to make that decision and be clear about it. And if it's the wrong decision, at least I'll support it and I'll align with that, but at least they had clear ownership of that, and we told them what the risks are, and we documented it, and it's part of our executive steering committees, and so it's kind of like pushing that ownership back up, that we versus I discussion that you mentioned before.